You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to episode number 174 of the Just Japan podcast, everything you want to know about Japan. My name's Kevin, and I'm the host of this weekly podcast that brings to you a different topic about life in Japan, travel to Japan, culture, history, language, you name it. And I'm really excited to be back with all of you awesome folks for another episode. That's right, 174. We're back to the weekly thing. We've got our stride back. Lots of awesome guests, lots of awesome topics. And this week, we're going to be talking about third culture kids, third culture children living in Japan. And if you're not sure what a third culture person is, you're going to learn about it today. It's a very, very fascinating topic. It's definitely something that I have been curious about, talked to people about, especially the friends I have who went through the international school system and where I live and work now. I definitely teach third culture kids. I work with them every day. So it's a very fascinating topic, and I think you guys are really going to like it. Of course, the Just Japan podcast can be found on all major podcatchers. Just do a Google search for us. We're everywhere. We're all over the place. Just Japan podcast. And of course, the home of the Just Japan podcast is justjapanstuff.com. So, hey guys, there's a lot of stuff going on around the world, a lot of stuff going on in Japan. But one thing that's kind of all the buzz in my household right now is the fact that it is Setsubun season. If you're not familiar with Setsubun, it's on the 3rd of February, and it's kind of a festival where, they used to say that if a child was bad or they were lazy or they didn't do their homework or they were bad in school, demons, Oni, would show up at their home and take them away. So it's something that's celebrated in kindergartens in Japan and at public kindergartens and private kindergartens, where basically maybe fathers of some of the children or different volunteers or male teachers at the school will dress up in these kind of scary demon costumes and basically chase the children around and scare the heck out of them. And what the children do is they throw soybeans at the Oni, Oniwasoto Fukawochi, I think they say. I probably murdered that. But they basically throw these soybeans at the devils to make them run away. And a lot of people celebrate this at their home as well. So when I was living in Japan, I would wear the Oni mask and I would pound on my door of my house and I'd come in and my children would throw the beans at me and eventually drive me away. So you have that. You also have and we're going to do that, by the way. We're going to be doing that this weekend. My wife actually ordered soybeans from an organic farm. She soaked them overnight to soften them up. And then once they dry, she's going to bake them. And then we'll have soybeans to throw and to eat. So another tradition is you eat a soybean for each year of your age. So, I'll be having 25 this year. Oh, yeah. No, more than 40. And that's always yummy. And then you eat a special norimaki, a sushi roll. And you have to, each year there's a special direction that you need to stand in. I think there's an app that'll tell us at our websites. And then you have to take a big bite of this norimaki. And you have to be silent while you chew and swallow. And you, I think, basically make a wish. Yeah, so there you go. So that's Setsubun. I think at different shrines in different parts of Japan. Not all shrines, but in some shrines, they'll celebrate it where people will be up on a big stage dressed like Oni, and people in the crowd will throw soybeans at them, and they'll throw soybeans and other prizes and presents at the people in attendance at the shrine. So yeah, it's pretty cool. So guys, this week in the podcast, I'm going to be talking to returning guest Felicity Tillack. Felicity is from Australia. She's been living in Japan for quite some time. She was on the podcast before talking about her 6-month stay at Koyasan, which is a famous temple in Wakayama Prefecture in Japan. She lived there. She worked there in the kitchen for 6 months, and that was a really interesting interview. There'll be a link to that in the show notes at justjapanstuff.com for this episode, of course, 174. But she has a YouTube channel called Where Next Japan, which is a really awesome YouTube channel. You guys should all go check it out. If you're interested in Japan, just do a search in the YouTube engine for Where Next Japan. Go subscribe to her. Now, a few weeks ago, I came across a documentary that she made. Now, this documentary is all about third culture kids in Japan, and it's really fascinating. That's going to be linked, actually embedded in the show notes at justjapanstuff.com. Go check it out. Watch it after you listen to this interview. I think you'll be really impressed with it. So she decided to make this documentary about third culture kids and guys, sit down and get comfortable and learn a thing or two. And learn, if you're not sure what a third culture kid is, you're going to learn today. So hope you enjoy.
The number you have dialed has been changed. The new number is... Please note, the new number is...
Folks, welcome to episode number 174 of the podcast, the interview portion. And this week, I'm very happy to have returning guest, Felicity Tillack. Felicity, thank you for joining. Yeah, thank you for joining us again.
No, thank you for having me back on.
Yeah, and a really different reason than the last time. Of course, the last time you were here, you were talking about how you just wrapped up living in a temple for 6 months. Yeah. But it's a very different reason why you're here tonight. But you know, there's a lot of people who may be tuning in to the podcast for the first time. So of course, I'm going to do what I do every episode and ask the guest to. I was wondering if you could introduce yourself to the listeners. Maybe tell us a little bit about where you're from and what you do in Japan, and of course, what the heck got you interested in Japan in the first place?
All right. Well, I'm Felicity. I'm from Australia, and at the moment, I'm a primary school teacher in Japan. And I got interested in Japan through school. So when I was a kid in Australia, it was at this interesting point in time when the narrative, I guess, in Australia was starting to shift.
Okay.
Because before my generation, the narrative about Japan was, kind of the scary, potential invader from the north. And that's kind of the perspective that my parents' generation and back had.
Okay.
But in my generation, it was really starting to change thanks to pop culture. That was the Sailor Moon, Gundam kind of generation. And, huge trade push. I think that was probably the main thing. Like Australia and Japan were becoming huge trade partners. So all the kids in Australia learned Japanese from a young age. So I had a teacher who had been part of the JET program, and she would tell us these incredible stories about her life in Japan. And for her, she's probably in Japan during the 80s when foreigners still weren't particularly well known in Japan either. And I remember her telling this incredible story about one of her colleagues, another foreign teacher who was Caucasian, had long blonde hair, and would love to go running kind of at twilight or early in the morning and freak people out because they thought she was a ghost. They saw this pale hair flowing behind her, thing come out, apparition, and they thought she was a ghost. So yeah, she filled my head with these stories of Japan and it being so different from Australia, and I really just wanted to go. So I did. I came over when I was about 21, and I haven't left for a long time since.
Wow, great, cool. I mean, everyone has such a different reason for getting interested in Japan. Some people it's it's something they've wanted to do since they're a kid. Other people it can be a very accidental thing.
I was talking to some guy who said that generations are different. There was a generation that came over for the jobs in the 80s, I guess, were really well paid. Yeah. And then there was the generation that came after Karate Kid who were interested in the martial arts aspect.
Okay.
And then the Pokemon kind of generation that came, for the games and the pop culture of Japan. So yeah, each generation has had its different kind of push, I suppose.
Interesting. Neat. Cool. Well, okay. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk to you tonight was, of course, about your YouTube channel and the content you create on YouTube. Specifically, one documentary you've recently created, a video. I was really excited to see. I have to admit, of course, I'm subscribed to your channel, but I don't have the time, as we all don't normally have the time to just kind of to sit back every day and watch hours of content. I'm subscribed to a lot of people, so I miss a lot of stuff. I'm not watching things on YouTube every day. So occasionally I'll see one of your videos pop up in my subscriber feed, but this one I hadn't. But before I'm getting a bit ahead of myself right now, you do have a YouTube channel called Where Next Japan. Could you tell us a little bit about your YouTube channel and the content that you create there?
All right, so yeah, Where Next Japan, it started as kind of an accompaniment to my blog, which is also called Where Next Japan, and the little subtitle, I guess, to it is travel, culture, life. So these are the three kind of aspects I focus on. It started as a way for me to showcase a lot of different travel locations in Japan, because I feel that people, they get caught up with Tokyo and Kyoto, but in between, there's all these spots, like for example, Aomori. Aomori I think is one of the most beautiful parts of Japan, but it's at the very tip of Honshu, and if you go a little bit further, it's Hokkaido. And I know most Australians would prefer to go to Hokkaido, but Aomori is gorgeous, but people don't know about it. So I wanted to showcase places like that. I wanted to showcase, culture. Japan has this ridiculous breadth of incredible festivals. From, the Crying Baby Sumo Festival in Wakayama to people riding tree trunks down mountainsides in Nagano. Like, it's just the creativity, the time that people must have had to think of these incredible festivals. So I wanted that aspect. And then, I wanted to showcase the life, of Japan. And I think that's something that people are interested in, because on my channel, my most, popular video is, how to use a Japanese toilet. But then the second most popular video is a video called Love in Kansai, which is about international relationships and the kind of goods and bads and interestings of that. So I think people are very interested in the social dynamics of Japan and how they're changing. Which, the where next of Where Next Japan is always, for me, rather than being like, where are we going next, where are we traveling to next, has been, where is Japan going next? And I think that that's tied to, when I started the blog, it was 2012.
Okay. Yeah.
It was after the nuclear accident in Fukushima. And at that time, I thought Japan is going to change dramatically, has to change dramatically to deal with this terrible disaster. And it really didn't in the way that I kind of hoped it would. But when I look back over, the time I've been in Japan, I feel it has changed in subtle ways. And I want Where Next Japan to kind of document that and be a witness to that. So yeah, that's what Where Next Japan is, I guess.
Cool. Nice explanation. So folks, that's youtube.com, I guess, or if you actually, know what, the way I found it tonight, just go to YouTube and type in Where Next Japan. Boom. It's the top thing that pops up. Okay, so this evening I wanted to talk about, I'm not sure, do you refer to it as a documentary? For me, it was very documentary style.
Yeah.
I don't want to call it a video, because a video makes it sound like it's something that it's not. It's about 37 minutes and change, and it is called Third Culture Kids in Japan. And I was really fascinated with it, especially because this is a conversation that I've had before in the past with people who are third culture kids. I know we have a mutual friend who we used to work with. By the way, folks, Felicity and I, a few years back, were coworkers. But we've got a coworker whose father's Spanish, mother's Japanese, and she grew up in Kobe and went to an international school, and she told me a lot of interesting stories about this. But for those out there, and I think probably, to be honest, most people listening probably have not heard of the term third culture, or third culture children, third culture kids. So could you tell us a little bit about third culture kids? What is a third culture kid? And tell us a little bit about your documentary.
All right, so I think the most important thing to clear up is that third culture kids don't just have to be children.
Okay. Yep.
Which is...
once upon a time they were kids. But,
once upon a time they're children, but a lot of them have grown up now. And they're children or people that were born in a country that they're not connected to racially, and their parents aren't connected to racially or culturally. And usually they grow up in that country, and maybe they pick up some of the language, they understand the culture, but they're told, and the classic example would be like a military family, like an American child born in Okinawa, for example. So they're told all the time, you're American, but they don't really have a true concept, I suppose, of what that means because they're not in America. And that's just the example. There's many different people who are third culture kids.
Yeah.
So again, in the classic sense, third culture kids usually go, air quote, home. They go back to their parents' country and then they learn to, they learn what that identity means and where they fit within it. But in this documentary, the third culture kids never leave. They're born here, they're raised here. This is their home, but still they're not racially connected to it. And because they don't look typically Japanese, there's that sense of distance from, the Japanese people around them again, I as well, I suppose.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I think about my own situation, which of course, the Just Japan podcast listeners know, I lived in Japan for almost 10 years, and my wife is from Osaka, and we had two children who were born in Kobe and raised up until last summer in Kobe, and now we're here in Beijing. We moved to Beijing, so of course, I'm Canadian. My wife's Japanese. We live here in Beijing. My kids go to international school, but the thing is, although my son, he's 7.5, but up until recently, they were born in Japan. They have Japanese passports, but they were born in Japan. They grew up in Japan. They didn't actually have foreign friends. They didn't go to international school. They went to Japanese school. They lived in a Japanese neighborhood. All their friends were Japanese. They grew up very Japanese. So I know, like, for example, my son, strong connection with Japan. He's like, Dad, I'm Japanese. And I'm not even going to, now, of course, I'm Canadian. He is a dual citizen, but he's never lived in he's never lived in Canada, and he doesn't have that connection. Canada's where Dad's from, right? So I'm happy that he's grounded. He does have that. Like, we went to Japan for the winter holiday, and I remember we stayed in Kobe, and when we got to Kobe, I remember my son just looking around. He's like, Daddy, I'm home. I know. Yeah, I was like, I got all weepy-eyed. I'm like, yeah. He's like, Dad, this is home. This is my home. And I'm like, yeah, it is. You're right, buddy. This is your hometown. You're from Kobe. So yeah, but
I have a student who's half Canadian, half Japanese, and in his situation, it's quite the opposite.
Okay.
I think he identifies much more strongly, and he's very little. He's only 8.
Okay.
But I think he identifies very strongly as being Canadian, even though I don't know if he's ever spent a long time in Canada. But his father is very Canadian, and he connects with the pop culture. He's a very literate little boy.
Okay.
So yeah, isn't it interesting, like how on the surface, on paper, this child's half Canadian, half Japanese, and this child's half Canadian, half Japanese, but they're completely different.
Yeah.
So
every family situation is so different. I mean, but back to the documentary. I'm curious. I want to know. So I want. Now, of course, all of you folks out there, once you finish listening to this episode of the podcast, you are going to go over to YouTube and you are going to search for Next Japan. And of course, in the show notes, there will be a link to third culture kids in Japan. But I kind of wanted to go through some of the different people that you talk to. Now, in the documentary, the first person who you speak to is Martin, I believe his name was, or he is.
Yep.
And he was raised in Japan, and he talks about having no real connection to Japan nor any other country. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about him and his story.
Yeah, so I felt that Martin was the most relatable person interview within the documentary because he's kind of the typical, I guess, situation of somebody. Martin is Filipino French, so his mom's Filipino, his father was French, and he has a strong family connection to the Philippines. And he was he was raised in Tokyo, and he went to an international school in Tokyo. So, international schools tend to have their own kind of international school identity, and through all, yeah, through that, he doesn't really feel very connected to Japan because, you know, Tokyo itself is a very, cosmopolitan city.
Yeah.
He goes back to the Philippines, he enjoys it, but he's not connected there. So, yeah, I feel for me like Martin's story was perhaps the most poignant. The idea, because I'm Australian.
Yeah.
And I have a very strong sense of my Australian identity. And, for somebody not to have a very strong sense of like knowing who they are, identity wise, yeah, it kind of that hit me the hardest, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I find that incredibly fascinating too, because I mean, I
Mm,
suppose, in very much so, I'm in a situation like yours, where I mean,
mm,
I was, both my parents are Canadians, and I don't know how many generations, fifth, sixth, seventh generation Canadian, something like that. Um, I was born in a small town in Canada, and so, and I was raised there, and I have a very strong connection with
mm,
being Canadian. Now, mind you, I've lived most of my adult life abroad, but
mm,
I'm still very much Canadian, right?
yeah.
I walk around saying a boot all the time, and thinking of Tim Hortons coffee, but no.
Hmm.
But I mean, but to hear someone say like, I don't feel connected to France, I don't feel connected to the
Mm,
Philippines or Japan,
yeah.
um, it's really interesting, because that's kind of a, until I came to Japan and I started working in international schools, or
Mm,
meeting people, who had kind of gone through that experience,
mm, mm,
I'd
mm.
never even thought about this kind of concept.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
for like, I can see the pros and cons with international schools. I love working in international schools. I feel that international schools expose people to, a global way of thinking. Of students tend to be very open-minded and flexible wherever they go.
Yeah.
But, I do worry that the international school like identity uh, separates children from the culture that, ostensibly they're within. And I think about like the school that I went to as a child, and the kids I went to school with were, kids of like Chinese immigrants, kids of Indian immigrants, kids of Argentinian immigrants. None of those kids had access to, this school
Hmm.
that was just, like kind of separate from the Australian curriculum. They were just in an Australian school. And I think Australia is kind of better for it. So
Yeah.
I worry that the international community in Japan is doing itself a bit of a disservice, in Japan as well, by keeping itself separate. But at the same time, I know I can understand why, parents want to be able to communicate with the teachers. The curriculum's really good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I can see both sides.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a term that came up in Martin's interview, and you've already mentioned on the international school culture. And again, there's something
Mm.
I'd never heard of until, um, I mean, okay, for all you folks out there listening, um, I was retweeting stuff about, about a week and a half ago or so, but no, about a week ago. Of course, January 17th was the 23rd anniversary of the Kobe earthquake. So I was
Mm.
retweeting an episode that I recorded, for the 20th anniversary. So 3 years ago, I recorded an episode of the Just Japan podcast, and I interviewed my wife about the Kobe earthquake, and I interviewed our friend Katarina, who I was referring to earlier. Katarina is an international school kid, and she's been on the podcast talking about the earthquake and things. And I heard the concept of international school culture from her for the first time,
Mm.
because she grew up, in Japan, going to international schools,
Mm.
and she
Mm.
talked
Mm.
about how kids who go to international schools have this kind of unique, kind of, how shall I say, experience. And now, of course,
Mm.
for all you guys out there listening, I work at, a big international school in Beijing, and it really is truly an international school.
Mm. Mm.
Actually, kids who have a Chinese passport cannot come to our international school. So,
Oh wow.
and we have we're right in the middle of the diplomatic zone.
Mm.
So a lot of our students are diplomatic kids, and whatnot. So, we've got kids from all over the place. And a lot of these kids, I've got, for example, one student who is um, Saudi Arabian, but she was born in Korea and has lived all of her life to this point, I'm a grade 2 teacher in China. And
So you're basically teaching like a lot of third culture
I
kids.
am, I am. I've got, I'm a cross country running coach, and I can remember there's this one wonderful
Mm,
girl in grade 5 whose parents are diplomats, and she was one day on a run. She was running with me the whole time, and she was just talking to me. She's so grade 5, so she'd be like, what, about 11 years old? And she was saying, hey, she was like, Mr. O'Shea, it's really crazy. She's like, well, she's like, I'm American, and I've never lived in America before. And she was like telling me all
mm,
about that. She was telling me like, I lived in this city in China, and I lived in this city in China, and I lived in Indonesia, and now I'm back in China. And it was just like, wow. And she's like this blue-eyed, blonde-haired,
mm.
awesome, super duper cool kid. And I was just thinking, wow, that's blowing my mind away, having her say that to me. Yeah. So international school culture, very interesting concept. But
Mm,
in your documentary, you had some varied stories. Now you
mm,
interviewed twin sisters, and they again
mhm.
had a very different kind of story situation. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so Jonah and Raelia are the identical twins in the documentary, and they're actually the eldest of 5 siblings, all of them girls. Um, and they were homeschooled. So their mum and dad came from America. They never went home. They brought their kids up at home with the at-home school curriculum, and both girls are, all the siblings actually have a really different relationship with Japan.
Okay.
So that's the first thing that I found really interesting. Especially as you can see in the documentary, that these, identical twin women, they have quite a different relationship. Raelia's an accomplished photographer, and she really knows her own mind. She's very decisive, and I feel that she sometimes has a difficult relationship with Japan because she is so strong-minded, because she, doesn't, always see eye to eye. And Jonna's personality is, she's, in her own right, she's a talented designer. She's an excellent watercolor artist. She's a lot she's a lot more accommodating. She likes to see other people's perspectives. She likes to, try and make people feel comfortable. And I think that fits more with the typical kind of Japanese kind of personality.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
feel even listening to her, she seems a lot more comfortable with Japan than Raelia does. Though
Mm.
both of them speak Japanese very well, both of them have careers that,
Mm.
that they've really pushed. Both of them are forces of nature that, out there, you know, pushing, forward. And everybody, it feels like everybody in Osaka really knows these two girls and loves these two girls because they're very generous, caring people. But yeah, I'm good friends with both of them, and I
Okay.
found their story, their like difference, so interesting, and I was really happy that they consented to being, interviewed about it.
Yeah, that's a really cool aspect of the documentary. And again, what I like about it is that each person, each kind of like person, people you profile have such a different situation, which kind of
Mm,
moves on to, was it Kira? Is that her name?
Kira, yeah,
Kira, the little girl.
yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about her and her situation?
yeah. So I interviewed Kira kind of indirectly through
Yeah,
her mum and
more her
dad.
mom and dad. Yeah.
More her mum and dad, yeah. And I guess Kira's she's the classic example. She's the military child
Hmm.
that was born in Okinawa. And I guess she's different in the sense that, like, her mum and dad have been in Japan for a very long time, much longer than the usual military tour. They were in Japan for 8 or 9 years, I think, at the time of the interview. And yeah, Kira was born in Japan, born in Okinawa, raised in Kumamoto. So she really considered Kumamoto to be her hometown.
Yeah,
She went,
in the interview, she talks about how she misses Kumamoto because her best friend lives there.
yeah, yeah, because they were in Tokyo at that time. And yeah, you know, she, of course, she stands out. She's blonde, she's blue-eyed, she's a beautiful, vivacious little girl. So that was another one of their concerns, is that, when they go home, when they go back to America, not only will she have to learn what American culture now is, but she'll have to like deal with the loss of all of this like kind of attention that she just naturally had for her whole life. So they were worried about, mum and dad were worried about those things, how will she accommodate or assimilate to America? They were worried about, you know, Japan's such a safe country. It's such a good country for young children.
Yeah.
Those aspects of moving back to America. But at the same time, they're worried about, well, what happens if we stay? What happens if she continues to grow up in Japan? How will she grow up? Will she, we saw the twins earlier. They're kind of a possible future of Kira. Although maybe she might have a different future. Maybe she might assimilate more comfortably within Japan. Who knows? But as parents of a young child, you're going to have these like concerns. Which path should we take?
Yeah. No, I mean, I mean, like these situations are all so different than mine, which is what I find so
Mm-hmm.
fascinating about them. I mean, as a parent, you've got a million questions on a good day, even if life isn't so complicated. Let alone throw in
Yeah.
all those cultural things, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So again, another very interesting story. And then and the documentary, the last person that you profiled was Tim. Is it Toishi?
Toishi. Yep.
Toishi. Tim Toishi. And he, again, one of the things that you guys out there, when you watch this documentary made by Felicity, you're going to really find enjoyable is how very different each of these profiles are.
Mm-hmm.
Such a drastically different and very interesting situation that people are in, which I suppose is kind of just like a bit of a window on what it's like being a foreigner in Japan. Everyone has such a different story, a different background, a different dynamic, and
Mm-hmm.
reason for being there, reason why they stay there. So can you tell us a bit about uh, Tim?
But Tim, yeah. So Tim really provides the contrast to the documentary, and I was so lucky to meet him. Tim is Canadian, and
Hmm.
his one of his parents is Japanese and one of his parents is Chinese. And he grew up his whole life in Canada until his early 20s, and then he decided to make his fortune as a pop singer in Japan, and he came over. And I met him, and I asked him in the documentary, where's home? And he was like, Canada, duh, like of course it's Canada.
Mm.
And after having interviewed the other three, where it's just like, well, we don't know where home is, and not really sure who I am, to have somebody, say with such like authority, I'm Canadian, and it really reminded me again, like, of my upbringing as an Australian, like, and all the kids from all the different backgrounds that I grew up with. If you asked any of them, where are you from? They'd probably be pretty annoyed. They'd be like, I'm Australian,
Yeah, of
because
course.
they are,
Yeah.
and nobody should question that. But Japan's still not at the point where you can look at somebody who's not typically Japanese featured and be able to, if you explained, and often I think maybe John mentions this, like once you explain, I was born here, I speak Japanese, you kind of, once you give all the reasons that you're connected to Japan, people of course go, oh yeah, you're Japanese, whatever. But it's not immediate. It's not just accepted, and it's not always accepted even after you explain.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
I mean, that's a topic for another podcast, but the whole topic of bringing up a child, for example, who's hafu, which is a term
Mm,
I've never liked, but half Japanese. Um, it was getting to that point when we left Japan, and by the way, returning to Japan is actually something a goal that we do have in the next few years. But my son was at the age where he was starting to notice like people are looking at me differently. He was never aware that he was, in his mind, because he's a Japanese kid, who has a Canadian dad. He grew up in Japan, just loving everything like every Japanese kid does, and just pure Japanese. But, because he looks a bit different, he was wondering why sometimes when he'd be somewhere, even with my wife, who is Japanese kids would yell English things at him. Hello,
Mm,
hello. And he was like really confused, like, Mommy, why are they saying hello to me? I'm Japanese. Um, or, people would be just like, oh, commenting on how he looks different and this and that.
mm.
Or like people would say, wow, his Japanese is so good.
Uh,
It's like, well, of course it's good. He's a native speaker, you know?
and I feel like Australia's gone through that as well. And
Mm,
I think that there's definitely people in Australia within my life who have I've probably, been a witness to as well. People saying, "Oh wow, your English is so good," when they're talking to like an Australian person who was born and raised an Australian who just is of a Muslim heritage or
hmm.
background or is of a Chinese or Vietnamese background. And I feel maybe that's why the topic resonates really with me is
Yeah.
because I've witnessed it.
Hmm.
And I really feel Japan is going to change. You know, I feel that change is coming.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Might take a bit longer than maybe in other places, but who knows? Who knows?
Hmm.
Um, Demographics are changing very quickly. Obviously, we all know about the more than looming population crisis in Japan.
Mhm.
As Japan gets older, um, it's a constant topic that you're reading about in the media in Japan about like who's going to take all these jobs, who are going to be the support workers to help the aging generation, who are going to work in the factories, or who are going to help Japan, kind of like forge ahead into the future because the population is just
Mm-mm.
getting smaller and smaller and smaller at a really rapid
And
pace.
a bigger percentage of it are children of mixed
Yeah, yeah,
backgrounds.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
I was told the other day something like 1 in 30 babies is a mixed race baby.
Hmm.
So Japan is changing. It's slow, but again, yeah, I think about the dramatic change in Australia. Australia didn't let in uh, non-European immigrants until 1969.
Yeah.
The Australia that my mum and dad grew up in was predominantly white Australia, and that's where the kind of blonde, blue-eyed Aussie image comes from, is that era. But Australia's not like that today.
Mm.
25% of Australia was born in another country, and I think Australia is better for that. And I think Japan, you know, having 1 in 30 babies born biracial, I think Japan is better for that too.
Well, I completely agree. I completely agree. Absolutely. You're preaching to the choir. Um, so, I think, I mean, you've already made it pretty clear, why this was an interesting topic for you to cover. I'm curious. Now, you already mentioned the twins who are in the in the documentary. You mentioned that they're friends of yours or the people you know. How did you connect with the different people in the documentary?
Most of them are just really good friends of mine. I've been
Okay.
friends with Martin since Ibaraki,
Oh,
which I
okay.
lived in up until the earthquake, the 2011 earthquake. We were friends then. Um, Mandy is actually also a quite well-known travel writer. She writes Uncover Japan, and she has written for the Japan Times. And we met on a monitor tour, and we've been travel buddies and onsen buddies ever since. And then, yeah, the girls and I lived within a stone's throw of each other in Ikoma. So
Oh,
I was
okay.
always
Wow.
over their house. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah,
So
no,
these are just like the interesting people you meet, and to be honest,
I have just been very lucky. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the things that you find, right, when you live in
Mhm.
Japan, is you just meet so many fabulous people. I mean, not, I mean, of course, you meet so many fabulous Japanese people who have great stories and whatnot. But I mean, the expat community, or in the case of these people, a lot of people, they're not expats, they're locals. But
Mhm.
you just meet so many diverse people, so many rich stories. It's quite incredible.
Yeah, and I love that's why I love doing Where Next Japan, I think, is the chance to get to talk to people in a deep way,
Yep.
the chance to say, "Hey, like this aspect I find really interesting. Let's have a really like deep conversation about it." And I've always been so impressed and surprised that people take me up on that. They're like, okay, yeah, sure, interview me. And I'm so grateful that people do that because I hear these fantastic, insights into their lives, their perspectives. Yeah.
Well, hey, again, preaching to the choir. I mean, that's why I'm at
Mm,
174 episodes of the Just Japan podcast, because there's just a billion amazing stories out there. And I mean, I
mm,
think the whole reason why no, well, I do know the whole reason why I started this podcast and called it the Just Japan podcast is because some podcasts would pop up where they just talked about teaching stuff,
mm, mm,
like
mm,
the teacher things, being an English teacher
mm,
or very kind of very limited things. But
mhm,
there are just again a billion amazing stories out there, and that's why each week, last week we talked about mascots. I had the guy from
mhm.
Mondo Mascots on, who has a Twitter feed just about mascots in Japan, and
What?
he's grown from in the last year he's grown from a few hundred followers, and now he has almost 20,000.
Oh my
When I
gosh.
interviewed him 2 weeks ago, he had 16,000. Now he's got almost 20. And the week before that, I interviewed Josh about the Kyoto Writers Group and being a writer in Japan. And then
Mm,
next week, last week's episode is going to be about ryokan and onsen in Japan. Just
mhm,
like there's just a billion great things out there to talk about, and so
mm.
many people with great stories. So, um, where next Japan, keep making that stuff.
Thank you.
Um, do you
Will
think
do.
do you think you're going to take on? No, I'm curious actually. Just from me as a creator, how long? I'm curious. From start to finish, did it take you to put this project together? Because I'm assuming it was a pretty. I mean, from like the traveling to the interviewing and the editing and the blah 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 and the posts and the
It took
this and that. It must have taken there was a hell of a lot of work put into that.
it took a long time, yeah. So three of the interviews were done kind of around the same time.
Okay.
Because I just happened to be in Tokyo, and that's when I interviewed Martin and Mandy, and that was pre-planned. And then Tim was like left field, like completely random. I just happened to meet him that week, and I was like, "Oh my God, you must let me interview you,
Oh,
please."
okay, okay.
I'd had the documentary like bubbling for a little while, and that's why I'd set up Martin and Mandy. But yeah, Tim was just luck.
Oh, nice.
That was
Because
incredible.
I was familiar with him actually. Like when I saw him, I'm like, no
Really?
way. I was
What?
like, yeah, 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 yeah. Yes, I knew who he was.
Uh-huh.
I actually knew who he was from like
Oh,
YouTube and stuff. Yeah.
he's very talented.
Yeah, yeah,
He's
yeah,
he's
yeah.
a really talented
But so I
singer-songwriter.
was actually quite surprised. I was like, hey, I know who he is. It's kind of
But you're
neat.
Canadian. Canadians always know other Canadians.
Yeah. So we all meet at Tim Hortons, the
Yeah,
coffee
right?
shop. Yeah. Um,
But but then the girls took a little while to pin down. Like an interview, just our schedules didn't match up, and
mm,
then the editing, yeah, took a long time um getting that all sorted out. And I think I emailed Tim the draft earlier uh last year, and he was just like, "Oh, that was such a long time ago that we did it. Um, I'm just going to go through this and make sure I didn't say anything that, I regret now." So, yeah, I'm glad that he it came back all positive. But yeah, it was quite a long time between actually filming the interviews and then finally getting it edited and approved by all the parties and getting the photos approved
oh yeah,
for
yeah.
for everything. Yeah, it took about 2 years, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've never put together a project like that, so I mean, I don't really have any idea. I've planned and daydreamed at one point in Japan of putting together a documentary about raising bilingual children, and I had approached a bunch of different people who all agreed to do it with me, for me to interview them and stuff, and I acquired the gear and stuff, but I never had the schedule or the time to do it. I suppose because I had two young children, and just with my work schedule,
Mm,
working 6 days a week, doing the thing I was doing. Um,
mhm,
but so I wasn't able to do it. But
mm.
it is one of these things that's kind of like on the bucket list. Or not even on I shouldn't say the bucket list because that means like I do it once and I walk away. But the idea of getting into documentary production is something that appeals to me. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
I find documentaries. you know, it's on the one hand, it's easier than some of the other kind of projects I've been involved in because it's just, a camera, microphone, and the interviewee and whatever questions you come up with. You don't need other crew so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just tend to procrastinate when it comes to the editing. I have another documentary that I filmed a little earlier than the Third Culture Kids about a group of performers who become the Aichi group,
Okay.
and also incredibly interesting. But I have a lot of trouble just sitting down and cutting it all together. It's as soon as I sit down, I cut maybe a little bit of it, and then I get distracted, and so one it's all the members of that particular ninja group have graduated and gone off onto different things now, but eventually the documentary will come out, it'll be finished.
Nice. Well, you've answered my next question about tackling another big project like this. You're working on it, huh?
Well, I'm working on that one, but maybe closer to your question,
Mm-hmm.
I am, I find the concept of identity like so interesting because, like, on a personal and I know that you can relate to this, like, I've been in Japan a long time. I'm gonna probably have a family in Japan, and I want to know where Japan is going. So
Mm.
I'm actually writing a script at the moment on the concept of, like, the future of Japan, because this year is the year that the emperor abdicates and a new era is going to
Mm-hmm.
start. So, and
Yeah.
it's so 150 years since the Meiji Restoration. So this year is like a big year, like, and Japan is, as was seen in the Meiji Restoration, capable of incredibly quick change when it wants to. So, yeah, I'm writing a script for a creative project while helping other friends working on their creative projects. An Australian director called Hamish Downey is making a short film about, no, a feature film, sorry,
Oh,
about Japanese lesbian relationships
okay.
and, like, the complexities of that.
Mm.
Another friend is making a film about, the aging population in Japan and how that affects family relationships. So all these,
Yeah.
like, kind of
Wow.
cool. I think that documentaries are one way to kind of showcase themes, and creative ones, are other ways. So I'm looking forward to doing those projects.
Awesome. That's so great. Yeah, it's
Wow.
great. I mean, it's I've recently had like the kind of creative spark relit under me.
Hmm.
My winter holiday in Japan just kind of reinvigorated me to like kick the podcast off again. And
Great.
yeah, well, because I mean, for the 6 months from August when I left Japan, I obviously leading up till my move, trying to get like all the housekeeping in order, moving out of my apartment, moving out, like that was a really honestly horrific experience.
Busy.
I mean, when you're single, it's hard. When you have a family, it's
Mhm.
exponentially harder. And like you've lived in the same place for 10 years, and you've blah blah blah. But um, I put out 2 episodes from essentially July until the end of December. 2 episodes of this podcast came out, which was a weekly podcast.
Yeah.
But as of this weekend coming up, there will be 4 episodes out in this one month.
Wow.
Yeah. Each week I'm back. That's a promise. Each week, every week, we're bringing it back. And the original kind of like listenership is coming back. I'm really happy.
Good.
Oh
Good. Good.
yeah. We've literally gone from I mentioned it in the year that I did kind of like a New Year's episode where I talked about my goals. My goal
Mhm.
is to get to 40,000 downloads a month.
Mhm.
I was almost there before. As of November of 2017, we only had about 4,500 downloads. But
Mm.
as of right now, we've got over 20 grand
Well done.
for this month, and it's just going to go. But I mean, I think part of it is, I mean, obviously, you know, I got excited about Japan again, and I think they're just the more I read in the media, the more I talk to people, there's just so many interesting things happening and coming up in the news. Again, like you said, your friend is going to be talking about or doing a documentary with the kind of like the aging population. Oh my God, there's a million stories about that. I mean, Japan is changing so much because of the aging population. Everything from the agricultural sector, aging farmers equals looming food crisis. Wow, there's a billion things, and I'll hopefully get a few interesting things on the podcast about that. But yeah, so where next Japan? There's one place we can find you. Where can you let all of the listeners know where can they find you on the social medias?
On social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram these days. I have a Facebook page as well, and I have a Twitter, but I don't actively post on it, but stuff kind of gets pushed onto Twitter like automatically.
Okay,
yeah.
so how can people find like your Instagram and stuff? What are the
It's all Where Next Japan. So if you plug Where Next Japan into anything, Instagram, Twitter, my blog's also called Where Next Japan. Just everything. It's my brand.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, it's good to have that one brand.
Easy, yeah.
Yeah, I unfortunately over the years have kind of had several different brands, so it's kind of a big mishmash of things.
Yes.
Yeah, so folks, go there, search all this, just search Where Next Japan on social media, and then go follow Felicity. And of course, when you go to the show notes at justjapanstuff.com for this episode, all the links will be in the show notes. So you can follow her there. And especially, of course, go check out her documentary. It will be embedded in the show notes page for this. And go check it out and share the heck out of it.
Yay! Thank you so much for showcasing it this week. I appreciate that.
No problem. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. I really appreciate it. So I want to thank Felicity for coming on the Just Japan podcast again. It was great to have her on to talk about third culture kids in Japan and to talk about her documentary, which is really great. Definitely go check it out and go subscribe to Where Next Japan. Go do that, guys. All the links will be in the show notes at justjapanstuff.com. So yeah, that does it for another episode of the podcast. Thank you guys for hanging in there, for listening, for downloading, taking the time to enjoy. I'm glad to have so many of you back on board. Of course, for a long time, the Just Japan podcast wasn't being produced, but we're back now each and every week. I'm really happy about that. Of course, you can make the show grow bigger by sharing it with your family, your friends. When I post a link, when I share a link on Twitter, please retweet it. Share stuff on Facebook. Let's get more people involved in the Just Japan podcast party, folks. And of course, over at justjapanstuff.com, it's not just the podcast. There's I write blog posts over there about Japan, life in Japan. Last week, I posted a few different photo posts about comfort food in Japan with a lot of great photos of food that we eat at my house, that we had at my house. My wife is a spectacular cook, and it's very evident when you check out those blog posts at Just Japan Stuff. I also wrote a very long, kind of a lengthy piece detailing what it's like to have surgery in Japan. If you're a foreigner, I write all about my experience of having hernia repair surgery, but it was more of kind of my experience in the hospital, not so much about the specific surgery, but communication with staff, treatment by staff. Also, how did I pay for it all? So it's all there. That's an article about having surgery in Japan. There will be a link in the show notes to that, of course. You don't even have to do that. You just go to Just Japan Stuff and you'll see it. That does it for another episode, folks. Of course, you can find me on Twitter at jlandkev. I'm very active there. Also on Instagram at jlandkev. Check out my YouTube channel, Busan Kevin, youtube.com/Busan Kevin. And of course, I've already talked a whole lot about this website. So there you go. Right, guys, that does it. Also, you can support the show over at patreon.com/justjapanpodcast. So check out, we have a Patreon page. I've got to tweak some things over there with rewards and whatnot. That's from a long time ago. So I'm trying to get more active and get some of you awesome listeners out there to support the podcast over on Patreon. So check that out, patreon.com/justjapanpodcast. There will be a link to that in the show notes as well. Well, guys, that does it for another episode of the Just Japan Podcast. Oh, I forgot. You can always email me at justjapanpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions. I'm forgetting so many things. The Facebook page. You want tons of news about Japan, a really great Japan-centric news feed? Go to facebook.com/justjapanstuff and like it. There's like more than 3,600 of you awesome people already over there enjoying the news feed. All right, guys. Well, that's it for me. Another episode of the Just Japan Podcast is done. It's in the bag. Time to drop the mic. Not literally. Okay, guys. I'll be talking to you next week, guys. So wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy, hope you're healthy, and I'll be talking to you real soon.